Friends, we're going to start the program for today. Thank you all for coming. Celebrating the 54th anniversary of the first military defeat of U.S. imperialism in the Western Hemisphere or in the Americas. My name is Morteza Bogzadeh. I'm coordinator of the Toronto Forum on Cuba. We do forums on Cuba. Last one we had last March, 29. It was on Cuba and Palestine friendship. Before that, we just keep organizing forums. We believe that to understand issues related to Cuba, so we all could take a just stand, since media propaganda, or I must say negative media propaganda against Cuba since the very first day of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 has been consistent. And today is the day where actually that invasion of Cuba by mercenary forces led by top military and intellectual advisors of the US government was defeated in 66 hours, less than 3 days. Today is that anniversary exactly. Today, actually, in Cuba, municipal elections are taking place around Cuba, where more than 8 million eligible voters will be casting their votes. I was watching some of it on satellite today. So these are things that we don't hear in the media. We believe it's important. It's important in the context of the wars of aggressions that are taking place these days, so fast-paced that last printed placard of the Toronto Coalition to Stop the War was Stop Bombing Syria. Now imagine you have to change that to Stop Bombing Yemen. Never mind Ukraine, never mind the recent military coup attempt in Venezuela and such things. This is how the imperialists are planning to move forward their system. And we believe the Cubans set an example by defeating U.S. imperialism for the first time in the Western Hemisphere in 66 hours. But I'm going to quote from Jose Ramon Fernandez, who was the captain of the revolutionary militia that was sent by Fidel Castro to push back this attack. And he says, they did everything to invade Cuba, to go about setting a provisional government, and then ask for help and support from their allies, especially from the Latin American countries, to bring down the Cuban Revolution and the newly born Cuban government, and just announced socialist revolutionary character of the Cuban Revolution when on April 16, the U.S. planes with the insignia of the Cuban Air Force bombed Cuban air bases, and when they were having ceremonies for the martyrs of those attacks, Fidel Castro announced the socialist character and socialist approach of the Cuban Revolution. And Jose Ramon Fernandez says that they did everything, but they forgot one thing. The power of steam, power of atomic bomb may be very powerful, but nothing could stand the power of the people. And that's how the imperialists, or the U.S. imperialism, was defeated. After the presentation of this documentary done by Saul Landau, who passed away last year, a U.S. Intellectual documentary maker, a friend of the 5 Cuban anti-terrorists and all that. After that, we have clips of Raul Castro's speech alluding to the Bay of Pigs invasion, or Playa Girón. We're going to have a clip of Raul Castro's talk at the Organization of American Summit last weekend, because as you gathered through this Bay of Pigs documentary, the plan was to set up a provisional government. The name of Cuban Revolutionary Council, where all the cabinet members were all stuck in a closed quarter in New York City while all these actions were taking place in Cuban shores and Cuban land. The plan was to call that provisional government and get support from all the Latin American countries, which later on we saw Cuba being expelled from the Organization of American States. And this year, for the first time, Cuba since 1962 was able to take part in this Summit of the Americas due to the pressure of the unanimous decisions of the governments, and I must say the people's pressure of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. Even though Cuba participated, and Raul Castro spoke, but since Cubans have called it the Organization of American States, the Ministry of Colonialism run by United States, Cuba will not become a member of the Organization of American States, as we already have something called CELAC in this hemisphere, which includes all the countries of this continent, Latin American and Caribbean, excluded Canada and the United States, where in the second summit of CELAC in Havana, Latin American countries and the Caribbean were called to be a piece of zone for the progress and advancements of the people's agendas and cooperation. I must mention when the first documentary by Saul Landau was mentioned, you notice those singing, those dancings, and also the farmers with animal farms working and all that, where Saul Landau is saying, yes, these were the way things were in Cuba at that time. Which you go to Cuba these days as well, you go to Tropicana, you see singers, you see dancers, of course you see animal farms. I must mention, those farmers before the revolution, a big majority of them, they had only worked for about 4 months of the year. They had nothing else to do during the year. Sugar harvest, sugar plantations, sugar mills were owned by US companies, and they had no jobs. The difference is today, those Cuban farmers, they have their own lands they are working on. And those animal farms, never mind the blockade, have become, especially since the 90s, where the special period, the period when there was no bread, there was no electricity, no water, and such things, because the US economic blockade became tightened, and Cuba lost more than 83% of its trade with former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe overnight. When the economy crashed, the Cubans had to use animal farms. Then it became part of the life, and in terms of organic farming and all that has become a movement in its own, and is continuing. And if I am correct, please don't quote me on that, I watched this thing on Cuban TV a couple of days ago. I believe more than 50% of the vegetables right now in Cuba are produced by these organic farmings that are done around the empty spaces, in the apartment spaces in the cities. That's how a movement it has become. And the movement for socialism and all that, if you recall the preparations for the invasions of Iraq and all that, in 2002, the Cubans marched throughout the island. You could page through this book. In rain, in stormy weathers, they marched, and then the Parliament of Cuba passed a resolution that made the socialist character of the Cuban state irreversible. So there are many talks when we are talking about Cuba, US relations, and so on and so forth. The socialist character of the revolution is irreversible, as the Cubans marched and with their feet and then voted for that. So I leave it as just that those two housekeeping notes I had to mention really. Otherwise we get confused. Well, we go to Cuba and we see Baradero singing, dancing, we see
I think I'm very knowledgeable about the Kennedy assassination and such, but I don't recall ever coming across that at almost at that exact time that Kennedy had reached out for a meeting and to open a conversation, a dialogue with Cuba. So this is news to me, and I find it very, very interesting. So you have evidence of this conversation or dialogue being started?
To the point that even Fidel Castro mentions, we have heard about the way that Kennedy was assassinated. The Cubans are of the opinion that terrorists of the likes of Posada, Carriles, and all that they were all trained by CIA in sharpshooting as snipers and all that. They were actually the ones behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy for, as some of them were saying in the documentary, that we were betrayed and so on and so forth. But as I mentioned, with the Operation Mongoose, you see the US government approach towards the Cuban Revolution never changed, actually became more systematic how to bring down the Cuban government down, because they noticed they cannot just bring it down with mercenaries trained all over the place and with the support of the US warships and so on and so forth, because there was no backing them. And with the Radio Swan that they used at that time, then you see that the evolution of that with TV and Radio Marti based in Miami and all that, then the scandals around those things. So those things have not really changed. So I hope that answers your questions. Yeah, the Cuban rightist forces, the ultra-right forces who were against the Cuban Revolution, who were essentially the torturers, those around the dictatorship, the capitalist class that had run away from the revolution, they really did not want, they couldn't wait, let's put it this way. Then they have not waited, and they are still impatient, even when the day of December 17, when Raul Castro and President Obama spoke almost simultaneously in Miami. You could see Luis Posada Carriles with about 100 or 150 or so around him. He was saying, well, we will finally shut these Castros and all that. So they are still impatient, because they always thought, we're going to get back to Cuba. We'll be there. We will be there. We'll be there. And they are still waiting to get there, but the Cuban Revolution just is deep.
The second one was, I was so impressed with what just happened in Panama, because the Latin American, Central American states stood up to the United States. And there was no declaration, because there was such a clear stance taken by the Latin American countries about what should be contained in a declaration. And no, American or Canadian government could have supported that statement, because it was just so contrary to the whole neoliberal controlling aspect. And so I was very heartened to see that Latin America had the courage to stand up. Because you don't see that. You don't see anybody standing up to the United States, and South America did.
The Cuban Revolution has set that example, that we shall not bend to the dictates of the imperial power and its allies. And that's why this Summit of the Americas had no final declaration. As Toronto Forum on Cuba this past few days, we made a statement that Canada and the United States actually had to quash a final declaration because they were not happy with such things. And you had to see the presentations by Rafael Correa from Ecuador or from Venezuela, Maduro and all that, at the Summit of the People in Panama. And how outraged the people were there, and the social movements were in Panama with the presence of someone who had chopped off Ernesto Che Guevara's hands in 1967. It's totally a different era we are living in. There was a time where they could arrest Che Guevara, chop off his hands, take them to the United States to prove that that's Che Guevara. And these days, as we saw, true followers of Che Guevara who went to Africa and were ready to fight against apartheid and all that, After 16 years being held in US prisons, they were released, the Cuban Five. The last three of them were freed on this route. But this all these miraculous victories happened because of that sea change in the mentality of the people in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, which Raul mentioned. Coup d'etat after coup d'etat, and military dictatorship after dictatorships, and now they cannot manage a military coup in Venezuela. Goes up in the air, you know, and the solidarity, that bridge of solidarity, I really like us who follow Latin America and the Cuba to see that when in Palestine, with so much misery and so much oppression and death, that the Zionist regime of Israel, with the help of the state and all the other organizations, bring on the Palestinian people, you see rallies and demonstrations in solidarity with Venezuela. And these bridges are being built. And this is what the imperialists, in my humble opinion, they have never ever faced in the 20th century, unless somebody can challenge that to say, no, we have had such things happening 60 years ago where the East and the West were bridging together and joining forces to fight the imperial power.
To understand regarding Guantanamo Bay, how come the U.S. has a base there? Do they own the land legally in Cuba, and how is Cuba allowing that nowadays?
As Raul mentioned, in the Platt Amendment, it was not only the Guantanamo military base, but imagine even parts of Pinar del Rio, where the good tobacco and Cohiba and all comes about. That was also part of the amendment. The Cubans were able to take those off this Platt Amendment. And the way it is written, the way it's imposed on Cuba, when they intervened in the name of siding with the Cubans against Spanish colonialists, where the Cubans had actually won the war in 1898, the way this is written is that we will be there to help Cuba, nobody attacking it. Never mind, United States is using that military base to attack Cuba. And the way it's written is that Cuba and United States both have to agree for this base to be emptied. Since 1959, Cuba says emptied. US says no, this contract says both of us should agree. So we don't agree, so we don't leave. And they have been issuing checks to Cuba. Of course, Cuba never cashed it. Never mind, no banks will cash a Cuban check because of the US blockade. So it is there, and you cannot, I mean, Cuba really doesn't have that military power to attack the United States. Even, it's very interesting to know, in this book actually is mentioned, when in 66 hours, the mercenary invasion by the support of US was defeated, Cuba could actually hit the US Navy ships, could hit them. And Castro said, no, don't do that. We don't need to provoke them. Because they may be using this excuse to really bring in the Navy to say, well, you attacked our Navy and come and help. And Castro said, no, don't do that. And then they turned and then left. Yeah, that's the situation with Guantanamo thing. And it was really nice to see from the summit of the parallel summit of the Americas, the one that was organized by the social movements. You know, the resolution was amazing. Not only US get out of Guantanamo, but calling for the sovereignty of the Puerto Rican people, you know, supporting the peace process between FARC-EP and the government of Colombia, supporting the right of the Argentina in its fight against this banking system that they want to drive Argentina bankrupt. In terms of Malvinas Island, in terms of many of the issues that the Latin American and Caribbeans are facing, that resolution was very. As you see, I'm wearing Romerias de Mayo. You might be asking, what is this? In the heat of the special period, in 1993, the young artists in Cuba got together and literally said, we don't have bread, we don't have water, we don't have anything to go about. We have to preserve our culture, a culture that essentially goes back to Jose Marti, who says, Patria es humanidad, or homeland is humanity. Let's preserve our culture. They got together, and that festival this year is going to be celebrating its 22nd edition. We have some buttons there. We have actually, as a small organization, have printed some buttons. We will be taking part in Roverias de Mayo with a group of new tradition music led by Ruben Escuera. I still don't know when is the flight actually the Cubans are asking. They will be performing in Cuba in this festival.